Queen's birthday honours are announced on or around the date of the Queen's official birthday in Australia, Canada, New Zealand and the United Kingdom. The dates vary, both from year to year and from country to country. All are published in supplements to the London Gazette, and many are conferred by the monarch some time after the date of the announcement, particularly for those service people on active duty. The 1993 Queen's Birthday Honours lists for the United Kingdom, the Bahamas, Solomon Islands, St. Lucia, Grenada, Papua New Guinea, New Zealand and the Cook Islands were announced on the 12th of June 1993. United Kingdom. Life Pearce Sir Richard Attenborough, C.B.E. actor, producer and director. Sir Ralph Dahrendorf, K.B.E. Warden of St Anthony's College, Oxford. The Right Honourable Robert Lee Pemberton, Governor, Bank of England and Lord Lieutenant of Kent. Sir Yehudi Menuhin, OM, K.B.E. violinist, conductor. Northern Ireland. Knight Bachelor Dr. William George Henry Quigley, C.B., Chairman, Ulster Bank Limited, for services to public life in Northern Ireland. Order of the Bar. Companion William John Hodges, Permanent Secretary, Department of Agriculture, Northern Ireland Civil Service. Edward Alexander Simpson, Director, Northern Ireland Courts Service. Order of the British Empire. Commander Civil Division Philip George Burke, Professor of Mathematical Physics, Queen's University Belfast. For services to science. William Devlin, Director, Local Enterprise Development Unit. For services to economics and industry in Northern Ireland. Officer Civil Division Cedric George Blackburn, Managing Director. Carl Construction Limited, for services to the construction industry in Northern Ireland. Seamus Brendan Boyle, Grade 7, Industrial Development Board, Northern Ireland Civil Service. Thomas James Carr, M.B.E. Artist, for services to art. Dr. Kenneth Edward Donnan, Chairman, Northern Ireland Association for Mental Health. For services to the mentally ill in Northern Ireland. Noel Jordan, lately Chairman, Northern Ireland Building Regulations Advisory Committee. For services to the construction industry. Professor Daniel Vincent McCorn, lately Board Chairman, Industrial Research and Technology Unit. For services to technological advancement in Northern Ireland. Miss Anne Geraldine McGrath, Principal, Little Flower Girls' School, Belfast. For services to education. Ian MacLeod Reid, Electrical Engineer, Bosnia Energy Supply Project. For services to humanitarian relief in the former Yugoslavia. Sister Karina Muldoon, Director, St. Joseph's Training School, Middletown, Northern Ireland. For services to young people. David Shackles, Principal, East Tyrone College of Further Education. For services to further education. Fiona Patricia West, Mrs. Simpson, General Dental Practitioner, Co. Antrim, Member, General Dental Council. For services to dentistry. John Vernon Smith, General Secretary, Ulster Farmers Union. For services to agriculture in Northern Ireland. Dr. Hilary Stevenson, Principal Scientific Officer, Department of Agriculture, Northern Ireland Civil Service. William James Stewart, Assistant Chief Constable, Royal Ulster Constabulary. Members Civil Division Miss Alice Gaynor Griffith Brown, Honorary Life Member, Ulster Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. For services to animal welfare in Northern Ireland. Rose, Mrs. Canning, Inspector and Assembler, Northern Telecom Limited. For charitable services to the community in Co. Antrim, Northern Ireland. Miss Olga Mavis Charlton, lately Deputy Principal, Northern Ireland Office. Margaret Elizabeth, Mrs. Cook, Administrative Assistant, Northern Ireland Civil Service. William Noel Davison, Transport Centre Supervisor, Western Education and Library Board, Co. Tyrone, Northern Ireland. Margaret Elizabeth, Mrs. Dawson, Administrative Officer, Department of Economic Development, Northern Ireland Civil Service. Frank Dolly, Supervisor and Trade Union Convener, Larnborough Council, for services to industrial relations. Thomas Richard Dunwoody, for services to horse racing. Elizabeth, Mrs. Fletcher, Caretaker, Olivia Centre for Resources and Training, Belfast. Albert Brian Ford, Constable, Royal Ulster Constabulary. George Allen Gardner, Owner, Beechwood Laboratories, for services to microbiological development. John George Gibson, Ambulanceman, Royal Belfast Hospital for Sick Children. Miss Agnes Mary Harkin, Cook Supervisor to Monkenis Primary School, Limavady, Northern Ireland. Francis Harvey, Supervisor, Northern Ireland Railways. John Gilbert Hill, Senior Lecturer, Down College of Further Education, Ballynahinch, Northern Ireland, for services to further education. Samuel Gerard Hughes, for services to the Newry Credit Union Limited, and the ECCU Assurance Company Limited. Thomas Joseph King, lately Deputy Principal, Department of the Environment, Northern Ireland Civil Service, and Mrs. McCann, Administrator, Community of the Peace People, for services to peace in Northern Ireland. Hugh McClune, for services to the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. Maurice Noel McConkie, for services to the community, particularly the disabled, in Northern Ireland. William John Murray, Chief Superintendent, Royal Ulster Constabulary. William John Nugent Porter, Tower Hill Hospital, Armagh, for charitable services to the community in Armagh. Thomas Patrick Palmer, Cattle Mart Manager and Foreman, for services to agriculture and to the community in Co. Fermanagh, Northern Ireland. Susan, Mrs. Patterson, Domestic Assistant, Musgrave Park Hospital, Belfast. Andrew George Scott, Constable, Royal Ulster Constabulary. Charles Gordon Watson, Sergeant, Royal Ulster Constabulary. William George Watson, lately Professional and Technology Officer, Department of the Environment, Northern Ireland Civil Service. Roland Brian Wright, Yarn Controller, Ulster Carpet Mills Holdings Limited, for services to the carpet industry. Queen's Police Medal Samuel Hugh Gibson Power, Inspector, Royal Ulster Constabulary. Victor George Shaw, Superintendent, Royal Ulster Constabulary, New Zealand. Order of the Bar, Companion Military Division. Rear Admiral Ian Alexander Hunter, Chief of Naval Staff, Royal New Zealand Navy. Order of St. Michael and St. George. Companion Mrs. Karen Margaret Vautier, for services to economics and business management. Order of the British Empire. Dame Commander Civil Division the Reverend Dr. Phyllis Myra Guthart, for services to the Methodist Church and Women. Mrs. Louise Etiennette Side Onni Henderson, for services to art. Mrs. Dawn Ruth Lamb, for services to education. Mrs. Augusta Wallace, lately a District Court Judge. Commander Civil Division Miss Susan Elizabeth Andevoy MBE, for services to squash and the community. Mrs. Teresa Eileen Friel, for services to the community. Dr. Owen Philbridge Haylock JP, for services to the timber industry and the community. Dr. Helen Hannah Rigg Hughes, Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. The Reverend Eleanor Glennies Lewis, for services to the Anglican Church. Mrs. Shirley Jean Martin, for services to the community. Norton Ross Moller, for services to business management and the community. Dr. Alfred Philippou, for services to medicine and the community. Military Division Brigadier Piers Martin Reid, Brigadiers List, New Zealand Army. Officer Civil Division Dennis Frederick Adam, for services to the arts and community. Mrs. Teaua Takotoroa Davis JP, for services to weaving and the community. Professor Mary Davidson Earl, for services to food technology. Brian Timothy Finn, for services to music; Neil Mullen Finn, for services to music; Dr. Dorothy Margaret Ann Gronwall, for services to neuropsychology; Ashley Robert Groom, for services to tourism and the community; Douglas Ian Howell, for services to business management; Andrew James Duncan Lane, for services to sport, especially swimming; Mrs. Roseanne Philippa O'Loughlin Meo, for services to business management; Barry John Patterson, for services to cricket; Brian Richard Parry, for services to business management and the community; Mrs. Shirley Joan Ross, for services to the community; Mrs. Jean Annie Walsh JP, for services to education and the community; Bruce Fergus Scott RVM, Assistant Commissioner, New Zealand Police. Military Division Commander John Robert Meldrum, Royal New Zealand Navy; Colonel Richard Paul Gray, Colonel's List, New Zealand Army; Wing Commander Peter Alexander Williamson, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Member Civil Division Miss Elizabeth Farrant Erie, for services to music; Christopher Arthur Amin, for services to motorsport; Mrs. Dorothy June Bell, for services to the Girls' Brigade and the community; Robert Victor Brown JP, for services to the accounting profession; Matthew Harold Cameron JP, for services to local government; the Honourable Frederick Miroslav Gerbik, for public services; Major Margaret Evangel Hay, for services to the Salvation Army; Mrs. Mary Elizabeth Fairmead Johnson, for services to local body and community affairs; Dr. Robert Paul Kibble-White, for services to science; Mrs. Blanche Lois Kingdon JP, for services to welfare work; Mrs. Robone Margot Lane, for services to the film industry; Mrs. Barbara Ray Mabbitt, for services to education; Mrs. Esme Leon Maris, for services to business and economic affairs; Miss Jennifer Ann McMahon, for services to welfare work; Norman James Macmillan, for services to local body and community affairs; Ralph Hamilton Roberts JP, for services to yachting; Mrs. Pamela Dawn Robinson, for services to the community; Mrs. Alison Pamela Rowe, for services to athletics; Maxwell Rex Short JP, for services to local government; Orma Maud Emily Smith, for services to dancing; Murray Mail Sweetman, for services to the community; Blythe Tate, for services to equestrian sport; Jeffrey Dawson Taylor, for services to the fruit-growing industry; Morris George Wall, for services to local body and community affairs. Military Division Warrant Officer Kenneth Allen Bancroft, Royal New Zealand Navy; Squadron Leader Noel Ward, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Queen's Service Order Companions of the Queen's Service Order for Community Service Bow Divine Hui Brecht Clap. Dr. Ronald Mackenzie, Huriwa Himania Poto, Miss Patricia Mary Payne, Mrs. Jean Helen Wood. Companions of the Queen's Service Order for Public Service Selwyn John Begley JP, Mrs. Elizabeth Ann Biddles, David Lloyd Lean JP, Mrs. Margaret Ann Bedgood Mulligan, the Honourable Herbert Elmer Lorraine Pickering JP, Mrs. Alison Burns Quentin Baxter, Mrs. Georgina Manunui Teheu, Colonel Thomas Frederick Llewellyn Ward OBE JP, New Zealand Army, Miss Barbara Frances Watson, the Honourable Mervyn Longluwa Wellington, Mrs. Maynau My Woodcock JP, Queen's Service Medal, Queen's Service Medal for Community Service Mrs. Joyce Evelyn Bennett, Mrs. Emily Jean Bachman, Gordon Frederick Burrows, Patricia Mary, Lady Corhy, Mrs. Myrtle Jessie Christie, Mrs. Joy Winning Keir Clark, the Venerable Archdeacon Anthony Ivan Clark, Erie Picard Coleman, Mrs. Angela Mary Cairns Costello, Mrs. Zilla Dixie Day, Donald James Fraser, Mrs. Betty Emma Garrett, John Stuart Gray, Mrs. Muriel Peggy Hannon, Mrs. Mary Latchmore Hassett, Morris Murray Hennessy, Peter Charles Henwood J.P., Mrs. Rosemary Ann Horton, Mrs. June Elizabeth Jones, Mrs. Lucine Foucault Kaloy, Randall George Cannon McMurtry, Peter Gustavus Lang Morton, Mrs. Sundarshan Kumari Rajpal, Deacon Elva May Reynolds, Stanley Edward Rowe, Mrs. Nancy Simcox, Miss Louise Juliet Sutherland, Raymond Pacamana Taurima, Jonathan Willem Edward Tucker, Mrs. Jocelyn Ann Whitehouse, Mrs. Olive Kathleen Wilkinson, Mrs. Keitha Jean Wilson, Mrs. Nanette Morgan. Queen's Service Medal for Public Services John Henry Black J.P., George Raymond Bransgrove, Mrs. Geraldine Buller, John Matthew Tauparkey Cribb J.P., Percy Bailey Lucas Cubitt, Dr. Shirley Juliet Dowding, Frank Jeffrey Fairfield, Mrs. Patricia Molly Gilbert, Mrs. Enid Marjorie Hay, Francis George Howe J.P., Jan Stanislaw Jarker J.P., Basil Terence Johnson, Mrs. Norma Beverly Lewis J.P., Mrs. Elizabeth Ann Lupton, Mrs. Daphne Francis McAvan, George Mason, Ivan Leonard Morton, Mrs. Shirley Dorothy Oakley, Mrs. Lapati Togaki Lopaka, Miss Coral Mary Ridling, Mrs. Mavis Jean Ring, Miss Patricia Helen Gillespie Ryan J.P., Robert Rawson Shaw, Colin Owen Douglas Siglikopf, Mrs. Jean Smart, Miss Mirta Pereira Terriora J.P., George Thu, John Duncan Usher, Dr. Geoffrey Llewellyn Walton, Dr. Joan Eleanor Walton, Simon Hallows Wood, Mrs. Marlene Tira Woods J.P., Mrs. Beatrice Thui Yates, Sandra Joy Manderson, Detective Sergeant, New Zealand Police, Gordon Oropata Ronganuik, Senior Sergeant, New Zealand Police. Queen's Fire Service Medal Robert Graham Sampson, Fire Force Commander, No. 2 Region, New Zealand Fire Service. William John Lester, Chief Fire Officer, Palmerston Volunteer Fire Brigade, New Zealand Fire Service. Raymond Neil Brokenshire, Senior Firefighter, Temuka Volunteer Fire Brigade, New Zealand Fire Service. British Empire Medal Military Division Chief Petty Officer Christopher Hikero Cookson, Royal New Zealand Navy, Chief Petty Officer Christopher John Halliday, Royal New Zealand Navy, Sergeant Michael James Clayton, Royal New Zealand Air Force, Flight Sergeant Murray Edward Ransfield, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Queen's Police Medal Anthony John Hill, Detective Senior Sergeant, New Zealand Police. Air Force Cross Squadron Leader John Keith Duxfield, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Cook Islands. Order of the British Empire. Officer Civil Division The Honourable Tinu Kamana, for services to the community. British Empire Medal Civil Division Mrs. Taiti Marie Kino, for services to the community. Papua New Guinea. Knights Bachelor Tumun Dupre M.B.E. for local government and community service. The Honourable Albert Kipalin MP, for services to politics and public services. Thomas Correa MP, for public service. Leo Joseph Wu, for outstanding service to the community and commerce. Order of St. Michael and St. George. Companion the Honourable John Nilkari, MP, for services to politics and commerce. Order of the British Empire. Knight Commander Civil Division Kina Bona, for public service. Charles Mayno, for outstanding public service. Commander Civil Division Guy Duwaban, for services to politics. The Honourable Albert Caro, MP, for services to politics and sport. Officer Civil Division David Robert Beattie, for public service. Xavier Justin Han, for service to the community and commerce. Arthur Llewellyn Jones, for services to agriculture and the coffee industry. Dr. the Rev. Sister Margaret Joseph, for outstanding services to medicine. Assistant Commissioner Robert Corris, Q.P.M. for outstanding services to the Royal Papua New Guinea Constabulary. Raphael Wimbari, for services to Papua New Guinea. Meliji Paivus, for services to the community, tourism and local government. Peter Ipu Pipal, for public service. James Patrick Sinclair, for service to literature and to Papua New Guinea. Ellison Tokai Vavo, for public service. Sam Tulo, for service to politics, public service and the community. Military Division Major Peter Ilau, Papua New Guinea Defence Force. Major Frank Torova, Papua New Guinea Defence Force. Member Civil Division Assistant Commissioner Graham Inui Q.P.M. for services to sport. Eleanor Batari, for services to the law. Captain Arya Buraga, for services to the airline industry. Eno Dera, for services to commerce. Inspector Margaret Garup, for outstanding services to the Papua New Guinea Correctional Service. Richard James Giddings, for outstanding services to Papua New Guinea as a magistrate. Marcus Kawo, for outstanding services to politics and the community. Pastor Charles Nombo Lapa, for outstanding services to the church and the community. Falema Larry Visha, for public service. Dr. Christiane Marjen, for services to medicine. Superintendent Napa Namain, for services to the Papua New Guinea Correctional Service. Major Taupala, for services to the church and the community. Dr. Peter Pangatana, for services to medicine. Richard John Pigworth, for outstanding services to dentistry and the community. Robert Affleck Robertson, for services to sport and the community. Ania Sengaro, for public service. Douglas Gordon Sharp, for outstanding services to the community and commerce. Captain Peter John Raymond Sharp, for outstanding services to the airline industry. Malcolm Roy Smith, D.F.C. for services to the community and civil aviation. Pastor Jacob Sode, for services to the church and the community. Julian Robert Thelwall, for services to the legal profession and the community. Imperial Service Order Companion Koiari Tarata, for public service. Keppers Isamel Watangia, for public service. British Empire Middle Civil Division Aleli Kathleen, Mrs. Agape, for services to Government House. Miss Helen Billy, for services to the Royal Papua New Guinea Constabulary. Senior Constable Charles Boy, for services to the Royal Papua New Guinea Constabulary. Senior Constable Piri Karifia, for services to the Royal Papua New Guinea Constabulary. Babel Kiaprizi, for services to local government. Simeon Bry Mediva, for services to Government House. Timin Ombiolu, for services to local government. Eliza Salot, for services to local government. Lance Corporal Sam Ingi Singer, for services to the Papua New Guinea Correctional Service. Constable Ben Theodore, for services to the Royal Papua New Guinea Constabulary. Senior Sergeant Epple Tobing, for services to the Royal Papua New Guinea Constabulary. Monica Mrs. Toaka, for services to education and women's affairs. Queen's Police Medal Chief Superintendent Samson Asai Inguba, for services to the Royal Papua New Guinea Constabulary. Chief Superintendent Samson Mapi, for services to the Royal Papua New Guinea Constabulary. Queen's Fire Service Medal Acting Chief Fire Officer Oswald Arisa, for services to the Papua New Guinea Fire Service. Acting Deputy Chief Fire Officer Roy Uram, for services to the Papua New Guinea Fire Service. Bahamas. Order of St. Michael and St. George, Companion Peter Ivan Bethel, for public service. Order of the British Empire Commander Civil Division Basil Lawrence Ivan Johnson, for public service. Officer Civil Division Leviticus Lewis Adderley, for community service to youth. The Reverend Canon Nehemiah Wilrow Dudley Strachan, for religious leadership. Carl Granville Treco, for service to economic and social development. Member Civil Division Richard Brent Malone, for services to art. Thomas Augustus Robinson, for services to sports. John Barclay Taylor, for services to culture. Corinne Loretta, Mrs. Patin Thompson, for services to education and the community. Leopold Garthright, Sr., for political and social services. British Empire Middle Civil Division Miss Gwendolyn Hall, for services to education. Audley Theodore Humes, for community service. Captain Edgar Osband Moxey, for services to Family Island communities. Solomon Islands. Order of the British Empire. Officer Civil Division Jonathan Wesley Cooker, for public and political services. British Empire Middle Civil Division Joel Hickson Donya, for public service. Adiatar Arki, for public services to agriculture. Michael Wallery Foa, for services to nursing. St. Lucia. Order of the British Empire. Officer Civil Division Leslie Reginald Clark, for public service. Johannes Leonke, for public service. Member Civil Division Josephine Siriu, Mrs. Rudolph, for voluntary community service. Grenada. Order of the British Empire. Member Civil Division Claude Bartholomew, B.E.M. for services to the Veterans Association. James Dilcassay Campbell, for services to farming. Herbert Winston David James, for public service. British Empire Middle Civil Division Virginia, Mrs. Lord, for public service. Cuthbert Bernard Snag, for community service.